All right, let's jump right in. We're going back to the end of the Second World War. Now, you'd think this would be a moment of global peace, a massive sigh of relief, right? But what actually followed was, well, a totally new kind of conflict. A silent, tense, ideological standoff that would go on to define the next half century. And this really gets to the core puzzle of the whole era. I mean, think about it for a second. For over 40 years, the world's two biggest superpowers were locked in this intense rivalry that affected nearly every single country on Earth, and yet their armies never actually fought a major battle against each other. So how does that even work? How can a war last that long without a war? To figure that out, we first have to get a handle on what this Cold War really was.
The Cold War. The name itself says so much. It wasn't a hot war, with direct fighting between the US and the Soviet Union. But trust me, it was a long way from peaceful. This was a war of ideas, a war of spies, a space race, an arms race, and, crucially, a war fought through proxy conflicts. That's where each superpower would back opposing sides in other countries' wars. It was basically a high-stakes global chess match.
So, what was this giant global chess match really all about? At its absolute core, it was a clash between two completely different ways of looking at the world. Two systems that many people believed just could not exist peacefully side by side. And this really lays out that fundamental divide. On one side, you've got the United States, pushing capitalism, democracy, and individual freedom. On the other, the Soviet Union, built entirely on the ideology of communism, where the state controls the economy and society for what they saw as the good of the collective. Now, these weren't just different economic policies. No way. These were completely opposed philosophies on how human society should even function. And that, right there, bred this incredibly deep mistrust and fear on both sides. But here's the crazy part. These two bitter rivals, just a few years earlier, they were allies. They actually fought side by side to defeat Nazi Germany in World War II. So, what on earth happened? How did that partnership just completely shatter so quickly?
Well, that wartime alliance was a classic case of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. As you can see here, once their common enemy was gone, all those deep-seated disagreements just exploded to the surface. At these post-war conferences like Yalta and Potsdam, the cracks really started to show. They just could not agree on what Europe's future should look like. And just like that, an alliance of convenience dissolved into a full-blown rivalry.
And this rivalry didn't just stay in the meeting rooms. Oh no, it spilled right out onto the map of Europe. A line was drawn, what Winston Churchill would famously call an Iron Curtain, and it literally split the continent in two. Now, if you looked at it from the Soviet point of view, their actions were all about defense. I mean, they'd been invaded from the West twice in just 30 years. To make sure that never ever happened again, they created this buffer zone. They installed loyal communist governments in the Eastern European countries their army had just liberated. For them, it was a strategic shield to protect the homeland. But the United States and his allies, they didn't see a defensive shield. They saw aggressive expansion. They saw a giant power imposing its will on smaller countries. So the American response was something called the Truman Doctrine, and it was a huge deal. It basically drew a line in the sand, declaring that the U.S. would work to contain communism and stop it from spreading anywhere else.
And this idea of containment wasn't just about the military. It was economic, too. Through the Marshall Plan, the U.S. poured billions and billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe, which was just in ruins. The goal here was really twofold. First, help their allies get back on their feet, but maybe more importantly, make sure that capitalism and democracy looked a whole lot better than the alternative, especially to people who were struggling to survive.
So you've got all this tension bubbling up, this constant tit-for-tat of political and economic moves. It was like a powder keg waiting for a spark. And the very first place where the Cold War almost turned hot was the divided city of Berlin, sitting like an island deep inside Soviet-controlled territory. So in 1948, the Soviets made a huge gamble. They blockaded West Berlin. They cut off all roads, all railways, all canals, trying to starve the Western powers out of the city. But instead of sending in tanks, the US and its allies did something incredible. They launched the Berlin airlift. For almost a full year, planes were flying 24/7, landing every few minutes, bringing food, fuel, and supplies to the people of West Berlin. It was a logistical miracle, and it became this massive symbolic victory for the West. It showed they were resolute, all without firing a single shot. So to wrap it all up, the Cold War didn't just start with a single bang. It was more like a perfect storm. created by all these key ingredients. You had a fundamental, unbridgeable clash of ideologies. You had a power vacuum after World War II that these two new superpowers were desperate to fill. You had this deep, paralyzing mutual mistrust. And then you had this chain of actions and reactions in Europe that just kept escalating the tension until the whole world was split in two. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. The Cold War was driven by this powerful mix of ideology and fear that literally divided the planet. It really makes you wonder when you look at the world today. What are the big ideas, the big divisions, and the sources of mistrust that are drawing the lines for us now? Something to chew on. Thanks for joining me.